Good afternoon. Hope you're doing well and that the week is going okay for all of you. It's midweek. We're midway through Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday at least. So happy to be here with all of you and to learn a Rashi from the fourth Aliyah in Parshas Ki Teitze. So many different psukim, so many different mitzvahs. This week's Parsha is particularly packed. So it's hard to choose from a lot of great Rashis, but we're going to do a couple here today. The end of the third Aliyah, which is yesterday's Aliyah, we sort of have a couple of mitzvahs having to do with illicit sexual relationships, and more broadly than that, not only about individuals, but about other nations that were allowed to or not allowed to marry into, and other people who are not allowed to come and be part of the Jewish people. So, for example, lo yavo mamzer, we're not allowed to marry a mamzer, someone from an illicit marriage. But more broadly, in terms of the national picture, lo yavo amoni umoavi bikal Hashem. We're not allowed to marry into the nations of Ammon and Moab. Gamdor asiri lo yavo lahem bikal Hashem adolam. Even the 10th generation, that's just an example, right? It's really adolam. Forever, the Ammon and Moabites are not allowed to marry into the Jewish people. Etc. About various averos that they did against us in the past. That's the end here of the third aliyah. The beginning of the fourth aliyah, and it's interesting why Chazal split up the aliyahs in this way. We can come to that perhaps another time. But over here in the beginning of the fourth aliyah, we have a distinction between Ammon and Moab, which we just learned about in the third aliyah, who can never marry into the Jewish people. And over here, other nations who can marry in, but there is a slight delay in terms of when they can marry in. Lo ta'ev adomi, you should not hate or abhor the nation of Edom, ki achichahu, because after all, they're brothers. We're all descendants from the same Avram Avinu. In addition, lo sisa'ev mitzri, you shouldn't abhor or hate the Egyptians. Kiger ha'isa be'artzo, because you did sojourn in their land. We have Egyptian heritage, so to speak. We have an Egyptian connection. We lived there for part of the time. So even though there may be restrictions, as we're going to see in a second, on marrying into Edom and Mitzrayim, there's restrictions, but we're not allowed to totally push them away. We're not allowed to totally abhor them, and we're not allowed to say that you can never marry into them because we have some connection, either a familial connection, or a living there kind of connection, as opposed to Ammon and Moab, who we can't marry into at all. So what's the restrictions here on Edom and on Mitzrayim? Banim asher yivaldu lahem dor shlishi Yavo lahem bikal Hashem. After 3 generations, they are allowed to come into Kal Hashem. They are allowed to marry into the Jewish people. Let's see a couple of the Rashis here on these two psukim. Lo seteiv adomi legamre, alfa pisha roi lecha letavo, sheyatza becharav liprasecha. Matam ki achichahu. So when it says lo sisa'ev, it doesn't mean you should not hate them at all. You should still harbor bad feelings. They did terrible things to Jewish people. It just means you can't totally cut them off. And again, Rashi says a similar thing by the next stitch of the pasuk. Lo sisa'ev mitzri. You can't abhor the Egyptians. Mikol v'chol. You can't totally abhor them. Alfa pisha zarku zaruchem layam. Matam shayihu lachem achsanya b'shas hadchak. Why you can't totally abhor them? Because after all, they did provide a safe haven for you when you needed to escape from the land of Canaan. When Yaakov and his children needed food, they came to Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was a good place for them to live for some amount of years. Yes, then they did terrible things against us. They threw our children into the Nile. So we can't not hate them, but we also can't totally hate them. It's somewhere in the middle. That's the case for Edom, and that's the case for Mitzrayim over here. Okay. So then let's see, though, the final Rashi, which I think is very important for us to think about, especially in this month of Elul. The punchline of not hating them completely is that after 3 generations, they're allowed to marry into the Jewish people. So Rashi points out that this is a middle ground. It's a middle ground between how we treat all other nations of the world and how we treat Ammon and Moab, which we talked about just a few psukim earlier. This case of Mitzrayim and Edom is somewhere in the middle. So what do we do with other nations? Shar umos mutarin lo miyad. Other nations we can always marry into. Now, by the way, caveat, when I say marry into, I mean after they convert. If they convert to Judaism, we can't intermarry. Talking about after someone converts, based on their heritage of what nation they come from, are they allowed to be part of the Jewish people when they want to convert? The answer for most nations of the world is yes, of course. On the other extreme, the answer for Ammon and Moab, as we saw a few psukim earlier, is absolutely not, never. The answer here for Edom and Mitzrayim is somewhere in the middle. They can't totally come in right away, but they're also allowed to come in eventually after 3 generations. So they're somewhere in the middle. So Rashi says when you put that picture together of the 3 categories, what you see is an interesting principle. Lamadata, what you learn from this is shehamachtia la'adam kasho lo min hahorgo. Someone who causes another to sin is worse than someone who kills them. Shehahorgo horgo ba'olam hazeh, v'hamachtia horgo min ha'olam hazeh u'min ha'olam haba. A person who physically kills somebody else kills them in this world, but they have an ever after life in olam haba. Someone who causes another person to sin causes them not only to lose their share in this world, but also to lose their share in the world to come. Lefika, therefore, we apply this principle to the nations of the world. Edom shekidman becherev lo nisaev v'chein Mitzrayim shetivaum. When it comes to Mitzrayim and Edom here in our psukim, we have a little hatred towards them. We have a little distance from them, 3 generations, because after all, they came to wage war against us. In the case of Edom, in the case of Mitzrayim, they killed our children. They caused us to suffer tremendously. So these 2 nations afflicted us in the physical world. So they did something wrong, and we should hold them accountable, and we should hate them a little bit, but eventually they're allowed back in. However, ilu she'elu she'echtium misabu. But the nations that caused us to sin, that's Ammon and Moab, the case of the Midianite women, and the case of Bilam and his curses and all of what they did to us, Ammon and Moab are never allowed in, which shows us the severity of causing the Jewish people to sin is infinitely worse. They caused us adulterous relationships. They caused us idolatry. They caused us all intermarriage, all kinds of terrible things, illicit sexual relations. So causing the nation of Israel to sin puts a forever stain upon you, so much that you can't join the Jewish people, even if you want to, even if you convert. Whereas causing us harm in this world is bad. We should hate you, but you're still eventually allowed back in. You're eventually allowed to marry into the Jewish people if you want to be a part of them. And I think that's an important principle for us to think about as we do tshuva and elo. We think a lot about ben adam l'chavero, ben adam l'makom, our own tshuva, our own improvement. We have to be careful not only not to sin ourselves, but not to cause other people to sin. Chas v'shalom, never to lead a person down a bad religious path, because the results can be disastrous, not only for them now here in this world, but for them in olam haba. And that stain is something that stays against us forever, as we see here in the cases of Ammon and Moab. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow. Hashem.